we normally get. Well, let's speak to Evie Aspinall, who is director of the British Foreign Policy Group. Evie, hello, good evening.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
That wasn't his first phone call, I think we should say. His first phone call was to President Zelensky of Ukraine. A statement first phone call, Evie.
Absolutely, a very clear steer. I think that the UK's commitment to Ukraine will be first and foremost and continues under Labour as it has under the Conservatives.
Okay, and so are we going to see absolutely no deviation at all from that? Is that sort of the point?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much exactly that. I think in the UK we've seen fairly bipartisan support for Ukraine, with perhaps the exception of Nigel Farage, who's tested that a little bit. But other than that, there's very strong support across the parties, and Labour are very clear and very desiring very hard to kind of show that they are just as strong on Ukraine as the Conservatives have been.
And I suppose there's a possibility, Evie, that as this war rumbles on, I mean, there's absolutely no sign of any, not really any sort of wavering of support for Ukraine amongst the public. It still polls incredibly high. People still, support is in. It seems to be sort of really entrenched, ingrained in the way that we are thinking about this conflict. But it is possible that over the next couple of years, maybe, that Keir Starmer, on his watch, sees that fatigue start to set in. How do you think he's kind of conscious of that, of continuing to sell the message to the United Kingdom as much as the rest of the world?
I think so. I think it's kind of top of everyone's mind that we can't take for granted that there is public support for maintaining commitment to Ukraine. I think the biggest challenge to that will be if Donald Trump wins in the United States. He's already said some quite interesting things about NATO and about Ukraine, and made very clear that his support is somewhat limited in that regard. And actually the challenge will be harder than ever for Keir Starmer, both domestically and internationally, to maintain focus on Ukraine, especially when we've got wars in the Middle East. We've got conflicts all over the world. It's hard to maintain focus on this one specific conflict.
Okay, let's talk about that war in the Middle East, because that's obviously going to be another of the big issues that he has to deal with, and it's been a real thorn in his side, really, hasn't it, over the course of his time as leader of the opposition. Splits on the left of how to deal with this. David Lammy actually more talking about this more than Keir Starmer has in the first couple of days, outlining a position of a ceasefire, a return of hostages, paths to aid, and support for a two-state solution. How do you see the pair of them, I guess, navigating this in their early days in office?
I think it'll be very difficult, particularly in those early days, but especially when we've seen quite big wins in a number of independent seats, with pro-Gaza and pro-Palestine candidates winning seats away from Labour. They'll want to be seen to kind of take a more sympathetic stance towards the humanitarian situation in the Middle East, and also at the same time wanting to make sure that they kind of keep allies on side. So the United States is still very pro-Israel. So it'll be a very fine balancing act for the two of them early days. But I think right from the start, they want to appease some of those in the party and some of those that might have otherwise voted for them, that they are still, particularly on the humanitarian side, focused on fixing that issue in the Middle East.
It's one of those, it's interesting, that, isn't it, Evie, because it's probably the thing that comes with the most. It's the international issue that comes with the most domestic risk for him politically, right? He is, as we say, under pressure from his own party and from the left, and we did see that through some of the Jonathan Ashworth, Jess Phillips, and Wes Streeting both coming close to defeat, in fact, in their elections, in their constituencies. And yet it also strikes me it's one of the things that he actually has the least control over. I mean, he doesn't necessarily have the ear of Benjamin Netanyahu in the way that perhaps the US president does. I just wonder if, what does he do? I mean, how can he influence events in the Middle East when he is, not junior partner in that coalition, but a junior-ish partner in that coalition?
I think that's exactly what, and I think that's been Labour's stance so far, is that it doesn't really matter what they call the conflict. It doesn't really matter whether they say this is bad, this is genocide, this isn't, in that they don't have a huge amount of weight. The kind of way they can have impact, I think, is really via Joe Biden. So I think they'll be trying to lean into that relationship they already have while Joe Biden is still in power, to kind of shift the tone a bit and move it closer to where I think the Labour Party more naturally is. But kind of big public statements aren't really going to have much impact. It's really Joe Biden who has the leverage here.
How does that change under a Trump presidency, do you think, Evie? Being able to have that word in the ear. I mean, we could hear the warmth between the two men. They're politically aligned, clearly. We heard the warmth between them there in that phone call.
Yeah, I think it changes quite dramatically. I think many of the kind of open channels of communication that we have with the United States will be much more challenging with a Trump presidency. I mean, even if you think optically, I think Starmer will face a lot of backlash in his party just having pictures alongside Trump, let alone being seen to do kind of big negotiations and deals. And I mean, we know already that Labour has been working for several months now to try and build relationship with Trump and with his team. And they seem to have made some progress on that so far. But across the board, there's going to be a number of issues where actually they're so fundamentally opposed. So things like climate change, support for NATO, China is the other really big one, where actually we'll see that the UK and the US are increasingly unaligned under those two potential leaders.
Yeah, it just reminds me of you talking about having a picture with him. Just reminded me of that moment for Theresa May where she made a visit to the White House and Donald Trump grabbed her by the hand and they walked down that sort of bit of a ramp together at the White House, and all the images were of Theresa May holding hands with Donald Trump, and he didn't give her much option, did he? She felt really sorry for her in that moment because she didn't really have very much to go, but the optics just weren't brilliant for her, were they? Really? Go on. Yeah. Go on, do you want to pick up on that?
No, I was going to say exactly that. And I think it's a lot easier probably for Theresa May than it is for Starmer, whose party are much more vocal. And I mean, if you even look at Lammy's comments in the past about Donald Trump, you can tell where the majority of the Labour Party sit on Donald Trump, and that is not in a very constructive or positive manner. So it'll be a very difficult thing for them to do to try and change that mindset and find ways to cooperate. And also, Trump isn't known to be a particularly forgiving man. So I'm sure he'll be holding some grudges about some of those comments in the past.
How does he approach NATO on Tuesday?
Starmer, I think, will want to go big. I think one of the biggest kind of critique that's landed quite effectively from the Conservatives during the campaign was around national security. Labour aren't traditionally seen as a party of defence in the way that the Conservatives are. So at NATO, on the NATO summit, Starmer really will want to kind of hit home how strong he is on national security. I think we'll see a lot about reorientating and refocusing on European security at the summit. And he'll see that as a real opportunity to kind of show himself as a statesman and show that the UK is in safe hands under Labour.
Okay, all of that, and we haven't even got to Europe yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so the most obvious, I mean, it is of course a continent with all sorts of different layers of political complexity, but obviously eyes on France with their elections tomorrow. Rises for the far right. It could very well be that some tactical voting keeps them shy of a majority, and of course there's a few years yet before a presidential election. But how does it will be Emmanuel Macron that Starmer will work with for much of his time in office. But how does Starmer navigate that problem?
I think it will be particularly challenging for him. A lot of these parties rising up in Europe are very different politically from Starmer. Now, there are some potential sort of side benefits, which is a lot of those parties are kind of sympathetic towards Brexit. They're also quite kind of concerned about the role of the EU, and so they might be quite keen to do bilateral deals with the UK. The challenge is that might undermine our ability to do some deals with the EU itself, which is quite a big part of what Labour is committed to. But it also means that there's kind of these more progressive ideals, particularly, for example, around climate change. There's a real danger for Starmer that he hasn't got a huge amount of allies on the world stage wanting to lead that agenda. Similarly, if we talk about things like development, there's a big focus from Labour around the global south and kind of rebuilding some of those relationships, especially when we see Russia and China doing a lot, particularly in Africa at the moment, to try and win power and influence there. We can't do that alone as the UK. We need, Europe, we need the United States as well, investing in our soft power, in our international development. And if they're not doing it, it makes it quite hard to achieve a lot of these progressive ideals on the world stage that, Starmer is really keen for.
Do you think that he will be sort of Tony Blair-esque in his approach to foreign policy, in so much as Tony Blair obviously got stuck in, quite enjoyed it, didn't he? Really put it front and centre, actually, of his time in office. Or a sort of Brown character who retreated a bit more, or a Sunak perhaps, who even outsourced it really for the last few years to David Cameron.
I think it'll be quite interesting to see because he's not got a huge amount of experience on the international stage. It would not really know that much yet about his foreign policy. What I think we'll see is that he'll be there on the bit. He would never shy away, I don't think, from kind of the big moments. We know he's really, passionate about international law. I'd imagine those kind of big things around UN, the G7, the G20. He'll want to play a big active role in those moments. But day to day, I think David Lammy is a really strong character. He's got a lot of commitment, and I think actually we'll see that he takes on quite a prominent role as well. So I think they'll balance each other out quite nicely. But I don't think foreign policy is Starmer's biggest priority when there are so many challenges at home, but maybe often the global environment necessitates that you do more on the international stage than you perhaps planned when you came in.
Okay, Evie, thank you for your insights. Let's speak again, and we'll keep an eye on what Keir Starmer, the international diplomat, looks like and what that shapes up to be. Thank you for your time tonight. Really appreciate it, Evie Aspinall. Thank you, Evie Aspinall, who is director of the British Foreign Policy Group, with us on